buenas, everyone. My name is Dayna Cruz, pronouns she, they, and today we will be talking about imposter syndrome in the sciences, the intersection between ecological research and the outdoors. I am a recent graduate from Wellesley College, where I earned my bachelor's degree in biological sciences. I would currently call myself an ecologist, mainly because most of my previous research has revolved around ecology, and I wanted to share a bit of my journey and what I have learned and am still learning about imposter syndrome. An ecologist is simply someone who studies the connections between plants, animals, and the environment. My experience as an ecologist is that most of my work time has been spent outdoors conducting research, usually referred to as field work, field days, or a field season. However, if you do not consider yourself an ecologist, a researcher, or a scientist, this is still a great topic to learn more about, even if you have the smallest interest in the outdoors. So let's get started. Let's begin with defining imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome comes in many different forms, but it can include the doubting of your own abilities and accomplishments, a feeling that you do not belong or that you are not capable, not believing you are deserving of where you currently stand, or that you received everything due to luck and not your own efforts. You may feel as if you have been putting up an act and failing those around you, or that you have been faking it all along. The reality is that you are certainly not the only person going through this. According to a systemic review on imposter syndrome, which included a total of 62 studies of 14,161 participants, rates of imposter syndrome varied widely, from 9 to 82%. However, results were higher for ethnic minorities. Although this happens to many, being surrounded by people that do not resemble you can amplify this cycle, which is what many individuals from underrepresented communities experience. Throughout my college career, I noticed that it took me longer to understand many scientific concepts. I learned that I am a visual learner and need to draw a lot of diagrams, sometimes in different ways, to truly comprehend something. Back then, I viewed this as a weakness, as I felt like I had to spend a lot more time on certain topics. However, I can confidently acknowledge now that this, along with my desire to share my work with my family, were the strengths that pushed me towards an emphasis on science inclusivity. With lack of diversity and representation within higher education, the sciences, and within access to nature, ecologists obtain a very influential position, especially BIPOC ecologist. BIPOC is an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, and Other People of Color. In 2016, a total of 56% of all graduate students were white. From 1995-96 to 2015-16, the graduate enrollment of students of color increased from 20.8 to 32.0%. However, students of color were still underrepresented when compared to the representation in both society and undergraduate education. Between May 1992 and April 2002, less than half of their underrepresented minority doctoral students in STEM programs earned their doctorate degree within 7 years, while a total of 36% withdrew from their programs. Communities of color are also 3 times more likely to live in nature-deprived spaces than white communities. In academia, we talk a lot about knowledge gaps and what we still need to further study. In science and ecology, we talk about how different environments have different animals and plant diversities. However, these ecologists from minority groups are standing at an intersection of multiple inclusivity gaps, where the scientist diversity is very low, yet not always addressed. This can make people who are not represented feel like an imposter, as it's harder for them to see themselves in the senior scientists or role models. There has been improvements in efforts towards creating a more inclusive environment, such as placing a statement of inclusivity within lab websites or job descriptions, but much more work is needed, such as the actual hiring of BIPOC staff and the teaching of work from BIPOC scientists. It is important to acknowledge that although the roots of imposter syndrome have internal forces at play, many external forces still exist that encourage this experience. I am sure you have heard of the term systemic racism or institutional racism, which refers to the systems or institutions that are perpetuating racial inequality in almost all aspects of life for people of color, including but not limited to wealth, employment, education, housing, and healthcare. This includes processes that directly disadvantage BIPOC communities and continuously place obstacles that lead to further disparities, thus making it very hard to obtain many of the same resources as your non-BIPOC neighbors. An example of this includes redlining, which is where certain areas on maps were sectioned and deemed either desirable or undesirable by government agencies for investment. This led to entire BIPOC neighborhoods being labeled as undesirable, thus making them less likely to receive any private or public investments, and more likely to be denied services by banks and insurance companies. Historically, systemic racism has caused many BIPOC to be less likely to attend college and be involved in STEM-related careers, explaining the lack of the representation. For example, public schools are currently funded by property taxes. This allows for schools in low-income neighborhoods, usually populated by BIPOC communities, to be less funded than schools in high-income neighborhoods. This current public school funding system is an example of a system in place that is perpetuating segregation in both class and racial inequality. The use of jargon, both in science and in any field, is a perfect example of a scientific practice that is directly discriminating against certain groups of people. Jargon is referring to specific words used by certain groups that are difficult to understand for people outside of these groups. This exclusive language can be discouraging to many for various reasons, ranging from language barriers to learning styles. My first language was not English, so it took me longer than my peers to begin understanding jargon, and even longer before I began confidently using it. However, even then, I didn't quite understand the necessity for all of it. At the time, it made me feel more professional and, in a way, served as a cloak that I thought helped me fit in. Living between this divide has transformed me into an expert code switcher, which is referring to the act of switching between different languages. In this case, between my own unforced, accessible language to jargony science vocabulary. However, as a first-generation student and as a child of immigrants, it was very complicated to explain my work to my family. Code switching exists in many different levels, and it can cause many to feel like an imposter as they are actively changing their way of being in order to accommodate and fit in. Similar to placing a mask over your own face to play a different character. This gap, this barrier, is what sparked my interest in combating jargon with science communication. A lot of science can be explained in such simpler terms, yet many, including myself, have been guilty of using this complicated language as a way to establish and allow others to recognize one's own intelligence. In other words, a way to show how smart you really are. However, sacrificing one's own image and committing a selfless act of increased communication is truly the smartest thing you can do for science, especially when your work is related to something like climate change. You want society to truly understand the research and not be driven away by super complicated vocabulary. You want more people than the 3 experts on the topic to understand the urgency of the research. Now, I understand that sometimes jargon needs to be used in order to more quickly explain certain concepts, but defining this jargon by explaining the meaning or simply having some sort of key for complicated words can solve this issue. Learning how to properly communicate science should not be a choice, but a requirement for every scientist. At Wellesley College, I was involved in the Pulse and Ecology of Place initiative, which inspires and prepares Wellesley College students across disciplines to engage with their natural environment and develop a sense of place on their iconic campus to enrich their academic experience, well-being, and community. Their hope is for involved students to become change agents who cultivate sustainable landscapes in communities around the globe. Here, I served as an anti-racism and decolonization ambassador, and I have learned a lot about the lack of representation in the outdoors and how one's own identity can impact how we interact and experience nature. I learned about the importance of acknowledging the land you reside on and learning about the ecological history behind it. Thinking about who has access to green spaces, the high cost of outdoor equipment, who gets advertised in outdoor-related activities in both marketing and the media, and so on. I personally never met another hiker who looked like me until senior year of high school, and I never met another field researcher who looked like me until after my second year of college. We need to continue moving towards the reclamation of nature spaces by BIPOC and the closing of the nature gap. The nature gap being how people of color, families with children, and low-income communities are more likely to be deprived of the benefits that nature provides, including the improvement of physical and mental well-being. Studies have shown that exposure to nature can reduce blood pressure, heart rate, muscle tension, and the production of stress hormones, possibly leading to the reduction of overall stress and anxiety. Additionally, nature can also amplify positive effects, including calmness, lifted moods, and reduced feelings of isolation. Many fields are teeming with imposter syndrome, so I feel very fortunate to have a platform where I can share my experience and knowledge, not as an expert, but as a growing student. So how can we all further address this within ourselves and within the field? By talking about your experience. You are not aware of what others may be going through, in the same way those around you may not know what you are going through. It is very important to talk about your experience facing imposter syndrome, as this can begin to slow the cycle. We will feel less like imposters if we realize that we are not the only ones going through this. However, the goal shouldn't be to prevent imposter syndrome altogether, but to be okay and thrive within this discomfort. As a queer woman, POC, and first-generation student in the sciences and in research, I plan to share my journey as a scientist through storytelling and other forms of science communication. The ultimate goal would be to create a safe space where students would be encouraged to unapologetically be curious, regardless of their background. On a final note, it is extremely important to realize that everyone's experience is different, and my story is only one from thousands. What power and privilege do you have? What can you do now to address your own imposter syndrome and combat systemic racism? When talking about ways in which society can improve, it is really easy to forget that you yourself are part of that collective group. Beginning to internally work on one's own views and acknowledging your own implicit biases should be everyone's first step. It is not nearly enough to bring this topic up. Continue to be complacent and participate in various forms of performative activism. An action item to begin or continue this journey includes educating yourself. Begin accessing inclusive resources by BIPOC. Here are some to get you started. The podcast Code Switch, hosted by Shireen Marisol Meraji and Jean Demby, where ideas of authenticity when switching between different worlds and different contexts are addressed and how code switching impacts every part of society. The podcast The Trail Ahead, hosted by Faith E. Briggs and Addie Thompson, bringing you conversations at the intersection of race, environment, history, and culture. The book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmer, addressing indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teaching of plants. And the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, challenges the reader's own views and discusses individual anti-racist actions to promote systemic changes. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you'd like to join me on this journey of growth and would like to learn more about what my path has been as a scientist, follow me at data_Dayna on Instagram, at datadayna on Twitter, and subscribe to my YouTube channel at datadayna. If you are interested in overlooked creatures of the understory, stay tuned for my next video where I will be narrating my science communication comic that I created as part of my biology senior honors thesis. Special thanks to Sidley Livingston for the digital portrait, Hubbard Brook Research Foundation for the resources and knowledge, Young Voices of Science Group for the feedback and support, and Thea LaValle and Sarah Garlick for the guidance and support, Sarah Elizabeth Stockman for the guidance, feedback, support, and friendship, and my family for the never-ending love and support. Hasta luego! Buenos dias, everyone. My name is Dayna pronouns she, they, and today we will be talking about imposter syndrome in the sciences, the intersection between ecological research and the outdoors.